In this video, I'd like to introduce the structure of the Gospel of John with a special emphasis on the first part of the Gospel, which focuses on a series of 7 signs. Now, I think he calls them signs because they point to the most important moment of the Gospel, which is the crucifixion and, of course, resurrection of Jesus. And the way these signs build toward that crucifixion of Jesus is a kind of layering of symbolism that I'd like to explore with you. So let's begin with an overall outline of the Gospel. Here you can see that the Gospel will begin with a prologue and end with a matching epilogue, but that the bulk of the Gospel can be broken into 2 parts. The first part is roughly 12 full chapters, and this can be called the Book of Signs, because it's dominated structurally by the presentation of 7 major signs that Jesus performs. Now, of course, there are other things that happen in these texts too, between the signs, but the signs really dominate the structure. Then we can speak of the last 8 chapters or so as the Book of Glory, and this will correspond to the Passion narrative when Jesus enters Jerusalem, the same Passion narrative that we see in the Synoptics. But the telling of the Passion will be quite different in John, and in a subsequent video we'll look at how the Book of Glory continues to layer some of the symbols that we see here in the Prologue and the Book of Signs. So we'll begin with the Prologue, treating it as we have in all of the other Gospels as a kind of overture to the themes that John wants to sound. And then we'll look in the signs for the layering of the symbolism as he successively moves through these 7 major signs. So let's begin with John's prologue. And as we saw in Matthew and Luke, the beginning of the Gospel often sounds the themes that we would expect. So why don't you pause the video here, give yourself a moment to read this part of the prologue, and see if you notice any recurring themes or motifs that might signal John's interests. Then turn the movie back on and I'll go through a few that I've seen. I'd like to highlight the beginning part of the passage. That is, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him not one thing came into being. Of course, this passage in its first few words echoes the beginning of the book of Genesis, and takes us back to that moment when God spoke in the priestly version of the creation story, and things came into being. So it was the Word of God that created things. Here Jesus is imagined as that very Word, so intimately one with God, and the principle through which the material world came into being. Now we can consider this a kind of creation or birth motif, at least I'd like to, in order to show how this idea will build throughout the Gospel. And of course, we have this emphasis on the Word of God as the agent of creation. So there's our creation motif. By the way, it's common for the word word to be capitalized here because it's being used in specific reference to Jesus. But of course, in the original Greek, no words were capitalized. Look at the second half of the passage. Did you notice the repetition of the motifs of life and how life was connected to light? And how that light shines in the darkness, so that the world is associated with being in a kind of state of darkness, even though it's the same world that was created by the Word. So there's this tension between the world as it was created by the Word and the darkness that currently dominates it. But this life that initiated life in the first place is the light of the world that can shine despite the darkness. The darkness did not overcome it. So this motif of life and light, this theme that Christ is the life and the light, is an important one in this gospel. And the emphasis on the world as dominated by a darkness, but the darkness is not as powerful as the light. These are themes within just this first few verses of the Gospel of John. Let's go a little further in the prologue, and on the right side of the screen I've listed the themes we've identified so far. I'll ask you to read this passage now. Go ahead and pause the video so that you can find the evidence of the themes that repeat here, or if you see any new ones. What I see in this passage is an emphasis that we haven't seen yet on testimony, because of course John the Baptist is being introduced here, and as John the Gospel author reports it, John the Baptist's role is as a witness, as if in a trial, to testify. The language is very forensic, right? It comes from trials and law courts. And John the Baptist is presented as a witness who testifies to the light. So the light motif is still here, and the darkness into which it comes, but testimony is also introduced as an important motif. Let's look at this passage a little further in the prologue, verses 10 to 13. Again, pause the video, see if you notice repeating themes that we've already identified or any new ones. What I see here is a new motif that in this sort of forensic context of a trial where John the Baptist testifies to the light, there will be some who accept the testimony and some who reject it. So we have this theme that will, of course, play out through the whole gospel, that some will accept Jesus, some will reject him. And of course, those who accept him are empowered to become children of God. There's our birth motif again, a whole new community is being born. And we hear of the difference between being born of blood, as if in the flesh, or to be born of God. So that theme is sounded right away. Birth motifs, a connection of blood to birth here in this passage. And here's how the prologue ends. Go ahead and pause the video, see if any of our past themes repeat. What I see in this passage is still the motif of testimony, and I suppose we see some new vocabulary associated with another theme, which is the intimacy of the Word with God. That is, that only the Son, who's close to the Father's heart, has made God known to people, that the Word himself has glory, or glory is visible in him, and so that idea of the glorification of the Word will be important in this gospel. We'll see it come to its culmination in the crucifixion and the resurrection. So we should expect that these themes we've identified in the prologue will be important themes throughout the gospel. Now, as I mentioned, John's technique is to layer stories upon stories and repeat symbols throughout them so that we build gradually in the gospel to the thing that John wants to reveal, which is the true nature of Jesus Christ. We can imagine it as a series of stories kind of layered on top of each other, but the thing he really wants to communicate is that sweet spot where all of the layers, all of the stories overlap. They keep reiterating, they keep emphasizing and strengthening the impression, the teaching that John is designed to teach. Now, this is different. It's not a linear technique where we're sort of building entirely to a single climax. It is true that the signs variously point to that climax, but there's a whole lot of symbols sounded in the prologue that appear over and over again in different scenes. And we learn a little bit more about each of those symbols, what they mean in each story. And so that's how it kind of builds cumulatively to a deeper, more profound understanding of who Jesus is. Well, this is a lot of text. This is the first of the 7 signs. This is the story of the water into wine at Cana. Once again, feel free to pause the video so that you can read the passage and see if you notice any of the themes we saw in the prologue. Now we have a wedding. We have the imagery of a bride and groom. We have the imagery, therefore, of a new life and the new lives that might come from them. So a kind of creation or birth motif at a distance, the wedding night itself. We have the imagery of wine and water. We have water being transformed into wine. We have this motif that we haven't heard yet of Jesus saying that his hour is not yet come, that there is an hour that will be significant in this gospel. What hour is that? If he's reluctant to do this just yet, might this hour be pointing to the hour when his glory will be revealed, which, as I've hinted in this gospel, is the crucifixion. We have Jesus refer to his mother as woman. We never hear her referred to as Mary in this gospel, only as woman, which seems very kind of primal. It's not accidental that the water that will be turned into wine is water that's used for ceremonial washings. Frequently in John's gospel, Jewish festivals, Jewish rituals figure prominently in the sign that Jesus is performing. And so we have here water for ceremonial washings being transformed to an entirely different, a richer purpose, the best wine that anyone's had at this festival. Now notice how this passage ends. Jesus did this as the beginning of his signs, his semeia in Greek, his signs in Cana in Galilee, and so revealed his glory. So we can see that the purpose of a sign is to point to something, and John is signaling already that what these signs will point to is Jesus' glory. Now, for some reason, Jesus had not wanted to reveal that just yet. His hour had not yet come. So we'll want to keep our ears open for when the hour does come in this gospel. But this triggers his disciples to begin to believe in him. Now, I'd like to just look at the series of events that happens right after this sign to show how they are tied to the symbolism of this story. So I'll just present them one by one. Right after this first sign of turning the water to wine at Cana, we have the temple cleansing. I mentioned in an earlier video that this happens early in John's Gospel. It happens at the beginning, the first Passover trip to Jerusalem. And it's at this temple cleansing that Jesus says, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." This motif of the resurrection or new life, new birth. So we have that motif. Then in chapter 3, we have Nicodemus coming to Jesus by night. And in their conversation, Jesus says, "No one can see the kingdom of God without being born from above." So there's our birth motif, a different kind of birth, not birth from blood and by the will of man, but from God. That was a theme in our prologue. And Jesus goes further, "This is the judgment, that the light has come into the world, and people love darkness rather than the light because their deeds were evil." There's our motif of light coming into the darkness, picked up from the prologue, resumed here to show us. And remember, of course, Nicodemus is coming at night. This Pharisee is too tentative to come in the daylight when others might see him. And so that echoes the motif here. We wonder at the end of the story, will Nicodemus ever come to Jesus in the light? After that, we hear John the Baptist's testimony about Jesus and his baptizing activity. And so we have more of the testimony motif to the true light in the world. And finally, in chapter 4, we have the story of the Samaritan woman at the well, where Jesus in his dialogue with her not only reveals her life to her, showing that he knows it, that he's at least a prophet, but gradually in every comment back to him, she recognizes something more deeply about who he truly is. And of course, that's the aim of this whole gospel, to reveal little by little the glory of the Christ. That will culminate in the book of glory, but already we see that dynamic building here in the aftermath of the first sign at Cana in Galilee. So the creation birth motif figures prominently, as well as testimony and life and light. These themes are repeated over and over again. Now, if we look at all of the 7 signs, we have this first one, water to wine at Cana. We saw the birth motif. We saw marriage going on. If we think of the wine as symbolic of blood, which it will be, of course, in the Synoptic Eucharistic symbolism, if we think of those as connected, blood and water are important, or wine and water are important images here in this story. And of course, the issue of Jesus' hour. When will it come? Has it begun? Well, let's move to the other 6 of the signs. The second one Jesus does will also be at Cana, although the royal official's son is in Capernaum. And so Jesus will heal that royal official's son from a distance, from the site where his first miracle or sign took place. This one, though, is a healing. He restores the boy to health, and so the life and death imagery is implicit in that. The question of whether people will accept who Jesus is, who this reveals him to be, whether his hour has come. Now, you'll have to actually read the passages to see these themes present there, rather than just take my word for it. The third sign is the healing of the lame man at the pool of Bethesda in Jerusalem. Jesus is back down there in chapter 5, and here it's a healing of a man, so his life is restored to him, full life. But it happens on a Sabbath, and so the question of the Jewish law and of the rejection of Christ for what he does on the Sabbath and who he really is, his claim to be the Son of the Father, these are motifs or themes that are building here and sounded first in the prologue. The fourth sign is the feeding of the 5,000 on the eastern shore of the Sea of Galilee. In the Synoptics, this seems to happen on the western shore in Galilean territory, Jewish territory. Here, obviously, bread is a motif and not one that we've really seen before. And as it was the king's responsibility always to care for his people, to make sure at least that they had the provision of the basics, the motif of kingship is never far from this story. This is certainly true in the Synoptics, where we hear of the feeding of the 5,000 in conjunction with Jesus' pity for the crowds because they're like sheep without a shepherd, or people without a king. The fifth of the signs, Jesus walks on water on the Sea of Galilee. We have again this question, who is he? What is his identity? Which we first saw in sign 3, when he healed the lame man and people questioned who he was. Jesus calls on his disciples not to fear. As we build to the culminating 6th and 7th signs, Jesus is back in Jerusalem when he heals a man born blind, which is understood to be a much greater miracle than simply healing someone who became blind or happened to be blind. But if he was born blind, a harder thing to cure. So the man literally himself goes from darkness to the light, and when he's challenged by the leading Jews, he testifies to Jesus, even when it's clear that it will be at risk to him. His parents aren't willing to do it because they fear the leaders. And so he will, though, gradually, like the Samaritan woman at the well, he comes to a deeper and deeper understanding of who actually healed him, though he didn't really see him. And so the question of the Jewish law, the rejection of Jesus, and his identity as the true Son of the Father again come up. So we see a kind of building of the controversies that will ultimately see Jesus executed. But it's really with the 7th sign that the catalyst for his arrest and execution occur. And in this gospel, it's clearly not the cleansing of the temple, because that happened way back at the beginning of the gospel. It's this 7th sign. When Jesus finds out his friend Lazarus is ill, he delays going there. By the time he arrives, Lazarus has died. He's been dead 3 days in the tomb. Jesus raises him from death. And when people know about this, the chief priest becomes worried that they'll begin to follow him as the Messiah. Well, in this final culminating sign, obviously we have a resurrection from death to life. We have coming out of the darkness of the tomb back into the light of day. We have the acceptance of the crowds of Jesus, but this triggers the rejection by the leaders who fear a revolt and the loss of their status and power. This, of all the signs, is the greatest sign of who Jesus is, and it will point in the most direct way, not only to the controversy that sees Jesus arrested and executed, but to the way the story ends with Jesus' own raising up. Now, one last thing to point out about these signs, 2 of them explicitly happen on festivals or the Sabbath. We have the healing of the lame man at Bethesda on a Sabbath, and then we have the healing of the man born blind. And we recall that the festivals are interwoven in other ways throughout the Gospel. Jesus makes 3 trips to Jerusalem for Passover. The water that was used to be turned into wine at Cana was water for ceremonial washings. John is a very Jewish Gospel, and he transforms the Jewish festivals into symbols that point themselves to Jesus' true identity. It is the burden of all of the Gospels to try to explain how the glorification or revelation of Jesus' true nature as the Christ is in a failure rather than a success, is in the cross that was raised up rather than in a messianic victory here on earth.